Hey, this is Shauna Hawk with the Women of Color and Leadership Movement out of Olympia, Washington. And you are joining us for Conversations with Women of Color. And here with a special guest,
Zarna Joshi from Women of Color Speak Out, Seattle, Washington.
So we're wanting to do this interview, and I wanted to do this interview to get to know more about you and what you do. Zarna, tell us a little bit about you and your journey and how you got to do the work that you're doing.
So I'm an intersectional organizer. So I basically work on the root causes of climate change, being capitalism, colonialism, racism, and patriarchy. And so understanding that, and we see that, it's not just one thing that's created climate change, it's all of these things. And that everything that we're suffering is different manifestations of those root causes. So whether we're talking about racial justice, whether we're talking about gender justice, economic justice, housing justice, food justice, reproductive justice, all of these things, on and on and on, we see that they're all connected to these four systems of oppression. And so what I do is I work on those things, and I focus in particular on patriarchy, because in my view, the systems of oppression all ultimately come from patriarchy. And I see patriarchy as a spiritual problem, because patriarchy tells us that we're just a body. We're just a body, and if you're in a woman's body, or if you're in a person of color's body, a black body, a brown body, if you're in a trans body, if you're in a queer body, if you're in a disabled body, if you're in an animal's body, right, you are inherently devalued. If you're in a poor person's body, you have less value than the value of a rich person, the value of a white person, the value of a cis male person, etc., etc. And so when we do that, and when we're made into just a body, that takes away our soul, it takes away our minds, it takes away our hearts, and we then become an object for the capitalist empire to exploit. So in my view, that's where capitalism, colonialism, racism comes from, because if you're just a body, then other people are just bodies as well. That means you can go and take their stuff. You can go onto their lands and take their lands and take their resources and take their water and take their fossil fuels and take their resources and on and on and on, and claim them as yours because your body has more power and strength than their body. Right? So we see colonialism, we see racism, we see capitalism, we see ableism, we see speciesism. That's all coming from this very patriarchal idea of you are only your body. And that is a spiritual problem. So ultimately what I do is spiritual activism, where we have to actually look at ourselves as spiritual beings. We have to understand that every single person and every single living thing is a spiritual being. And if we can understand each other in that way, then we can connect in a way that is much deeper, in a way that it is spiritual, that is loving, that is compassionate. And if we do that, we are ultimately able to work towards collective liberation. And so that is what I do, and that means that I work on simultaneous issues. It means I mentor youth. It means I mentor men in how to dismantle their own patriarchy. I mentor people of color and women about our internalized oppression, because when you're told over and over and over again, since the moment that you're born, that you matter less, you have less value, you were born to please others, when you're told that enough, you start to believe it. And if you believe it, you then put that type of violence on others and retell that story. And that is one of the reasons why one of the biggest problems in patriarchy is the women who reinforce it. And in particular, the white women who reinforce it against women of color and queer and trans people of color. And so these are all things that I work on at the grassroots level, because that's the only place where change ever really comes, is at the grassroots level in communities. And so that's the work that I do. And I do direct action. I'm a vegan for climate reasons. I was raised vegetarian by my family for spiritual reasons and cultural reasons, and I went completely vegan for climate reasons and social justice reasons, because animals are also made into objects by a patriarchal capitalist empire. Animals are also treated as if they exist for our pleasure, and that their consent doesn't matter, and that they don't have a right to exist if we decide we can just take them. And so that's one of the things that I do. I work on food justice, I work on food sovereignty issues, I work in solidarity with Indigenous people. I work in solidarity with queer and trans people, particularly queer and trans people of color. I work to make the climate movement a safe place for people of color, because we know the climate movement has always been led by people of color and Native people. But the problem is that the people who are in the news, the people who have all of the money and the resources with these giant green, non-profits, are white people. And yet they are not on the front lines, and therefore they have no understanding of how to actually deal with the problem, because they don't understand the systems of oppression. And so because of their own white supremacy, their own patriarchy, they keep people of color at the bottom in the movement. And that's a disaster, because we're going to lose that way. And so what I do is I work on educating white people so that they can understand how to be better allies, actual allies, as opposed to just using the word and not actually following through. And meanwhile, I work on making the climate movement a safer space for people of color, so that we can know that this is our place, this is our home. We should be leading, we should be at the forefront, we should be speaking, particularly women of color, particularly queer and trans people of color. That is our role, is that we should be in leadership. So that is the work that I do.
So you mentioned a couple of things that just stirred up some questions. And one, I do want to bring up or talk about how trans and queer people of color, but in particular trans women and cis women, can come to the table. We were talking about a little bit about this earlier. Should come to the table and talk together without cis men, be it cis men of color or white cis men at the table. That's a conversation that needs to be had for our healing and our unity. And give us some thoughts on that.
I think that, as a straight cis woman with straight cis privilege, I think that there's a great deal of work that needs to happen within cis circles, between cis women of color, to talk about our cis privilege, to talk about whether we have cis privilege, whether we have straight privilege, to talk about those things so that we can understand how we can be better allies to trans people, and particularly trans people of color. So I feel like that's the first conversation that needs to happen. I feel like there also needs to be a conversation amongst queer and trans people also, for their own benefit, about their own internalized issues, because as we said, like, we've all been told these stories so often, we've all had that reinforced so many times, that we have to do that work to actually peel back all of these layers of like oppression, all of these lies that we've been told. And I feel like people need to have safe spaces to do that. And only when we have really been doing genuine work to peel back our cis sexism, our straight pride, all of those things, can we then try to create a safe space to have that joint conversation. Because if we don't do that, then we're just going to cause harm to people with less privilege than us, and that would be a disaster. That wouldn't be healing. So I feel like the first step for us as cis women of color is that we first need to work on our own stuff together, in solidarity, so that we can try to deal with some of our own cis pride and some of our straight pride and all of those issues, all of those ways in which we have had some little pieces of power, and start to dismantle that within ourselves, because we shouldn't be gaining power by putting down anyone else, right? Ever. That's not liberation for anyone. And so as part of our struggle for our freedom, we also need to be understanding that our freedom is bound up in everyone else's freedom. And unless all of us are free, none of us is free. And so that's how I'm coming at it. That first we have to look at our own issues, and then when we've done that work, we can then reach out and say, can we have some type of conversation so that we can find out from you in what ways we can better serve as allies.
I think I would add to that my own personal opinion and experience around being a cis Black woman, and how I feel like privilege definitely is a part of that, but also talking about misogyny within the LGBTQ community. And I think that the conversation that I call for is a conversation between trans women of color and black and brown women coming to the table together, because there is privilege within trans communities as well, and talking about that and what that looks like. And that's why I think that when you're talking about white trans people, you're talking about trans people of color, that's a whole different dynamic, a whole different power dynamic. So having those conversations is really important, and a conversation that I would like to personally see, because there's a, you know, I think when we're talking about some of that gender pride or even cis women's pride, aside from white women's pride, we're not talking about that, so try to separate.
Which is a whole different monster.
Whole different thing. And I think that, you know, and I can speak for me as a black woman, my experiences have been being told that I'm not feminine, being told that I'm not a woman, and not even being treated that way, but having and seeing, you know, even lighter skin, because of course the shadeism and the colorism is a huge piece of that, and then also being told, you know, that I'm bad, dirty, ugly ever since I was a very little girl on. So that's where I think a lot of the pain and a lot of the conversation piece could come from. Like, what has been your experience from what you've been taught about women, whether you be, you know, cis or LGBTQ plus part of that community? Have you been told these negative messages about womanhood and about the divine feminine? I come from that place, and how does that play into these feelings of, I think, scarcity is what a lot of it is coming from. So definitely, you know, some powerful conversations to be had that I would love to facilitate and be a part of. Again, aside and not with cis men of any color at the table, because I think that's a really important piece to add. But then also too, you had brought up something too a little bit, and I want you to go a little bit deeper in how does capitalism, you know, really influence these movements and you know, the piece that it plays.
Well, I think that you brought it up yourself, right? This idea of scarcity, right? This idea of like, quick, the men are scarce, we've got to snap them up. That means all the women have to be competing against each other. That means we have to be hyper feminine. And of course, this idea of femininity is coming from the white males, you know, the white supremacist male patriarchy, which is then selling us an idea of femininity. So you got to buy these pink razors to shave your legs, because having smooth, soft, you know, hairless legs is feminine, which makes absolutely no sense, because, you know, we were all born with hair on our legs. That's how it works. You know, this idea of, you know, you have to be a certain size, and if you're not a certain size, here are all these products of all these pills, all these diets, all of these things that we could sell you to make you this size. Here's a corset. It wasn't black or brown people who invented corsets, it was white people, and they sold them. And it's like they sell fear. Capitalism sells fear. It thrives on fear, because if you're afraid, you're going to buy things to give you a false sense of security. But the truth is, the only thing that's really going to give you a sense of security is if you know that you belong, is if you know that you're loved and accepted by your people, no matter who they are, no matter what they look like, no matter what you look like, no matter what you are, no matter where you come from, no matter what language you speak, you are still accepted and welcome and loved as you are. That's the only thing that's ever going to make anyone feel safe. But instead, we're told we don't belong. We're told you have to conform, and if you don't conform, no one's going to want you, and then you're going to die poor and lonely. So you better go work for the man and make him money, and then if you're lucky, he'll give you a promotion. But really he won't. He'll just keep you down in that same place, and particularly if you're a woman of color, you'll be kept down no matter what. And it's, you know, and what they do is they use the token woman, they use the token person of color, they use the token queer person as their way of like, look, these people did it, but that person was a capitalist who didn't care who they had to step on in order to get there. And it doesn't mean that they didn't struggle, but what it means is that those of us with conscience who want to bring everyone with us as opposed to fight with everyone else, it means all of those people get left behind. So capitalism is in and of itself something that thrives on fear, thrives on scarcity, thrives on this idea that everyone is your competition. And so all of the women hate each other, as opposed to protecting each other. They hate each other because they're all competing for the same man, or they're competing for the same job, or they all want to be the ones who are on the magazine cover, or they all want to be the ones worshipped as the most beautiful looking woman in the whole world. But of course, the only one who's going to be deciding that is a white male. And of course, just the very absurdity of, beauty being decided by one particular demographic or one particular community is just the opposite of what biodiversity is. And we cannot thrive without biodiversity. But what capitalism is we want everyone to be conforming to one box, and we're going to give you all of these other boxes for you to buy to get to this one box. And so it's like everyone's trying to step over all of these boxes to grab this one box, and very few people ever make it, which is what is the very definition of 1%.
So we talked about this at another time, one of our other conversations, and can you speak a little bit about your experience with, because when you talk about white cis males in particular, how black and brown men play into misogyny?
Right. So, we have cultures that are thousands and thousands of years old, and what you see in so many cultures, particularly indigenous cultures, is that there was a great deal of respect and value placed in the matriarch, placed in the role of the woman in the household, in the family, in the community, as an elder. And it is not that there was not misogyny in certain black and brown cultures. It is not that there was not patriarchy there. But at the same time, there was the divine feminine idea. There was the idea of respect for motherhood, respect for the matriarch, respect for the goddess. And so even though there may have been patriarchy, there is also this love and respect for that other part of life, without which we wouldn't exist. And what has happened throughout colonialism, throughout the white supremacist patriarchy colonizing everyone else, is that the white male dominant empire imposed its patriarchy on everyone else. And in that patriarchy, only white men are considered men, which means that black and brown men were devalued. They were not allowed to be men. And that means that they're going to have a great deal of anger. But they can't take it out on the white men. They take it out on the black and brown women, which of course we know as black and brown women. And they take it out on the queer people, they take it out on the trans people. And meanwhile, black and brown men value white women and put them on a pedestal because of their internalized white supremacy. So even though they say that they're struggling against white supremacy, as you and I both know, really what they're doing is upholding male supremacy and black and brown male supremacy over black and brown women and queer and trans people. And so it's just another form of patriarchy. And that has continued to be a toxic part of our movement. And it's something that has to be dismantled, because if we don't dismantle it, again, we are not acting for collective liberation. And our movements are not safe. They're not safe spaces for women of color, and it has to be a safe space for women of color because we must be leading.
So a little bit more on black women in particular, and some of the things that you've identified within black women and black men, and you being a brown woman and kind of in the middle of that.
So as a brown woman, I know that I must be an ally to my black sisters. And, one of the ways in which I've tried to do that is to try to be the go-between when there is some tension happening, when black women are being silenced, when they're being marginalized by black men. And what I have found is that in those scenarios, what almost always happens is the black men then turn that violence towards me as a proxy for the black women. And this is, as a brown woman, I'm seeing this by proxy. So I can't imagine how bad it really must be for black women. because the violence is so stark, like trying to silence you. And then, of course, the gaslighting, the scapegoating, just the general, saying that you're crazy, saying that you're hysterical. And I've had this happen to me, and it has been toxic black men who have done this to me because I have been an ally for black women. So it's pretty clear, that level of violence that is there towards black women. But as a brown woman, I can only say what I have witnessed, and having witnessed what I've witnessed, I can't imagine how much worse it really is.
So it definitely is. And thank you for that. And that's one of the things that actually got me to really respecting you and listening to you, the fact that you acknowledge that. Because there are many, either they're mixed women, lighter skinned women, that really don't want to call that out. I mean, because some of them enjoy their positions of, being what's that word? When they fetishized and, so and exalted, all of that. And so they won't speak on those issues until it affects them. Oftentimes what I'll see is very lighter skinned women, mixed women, brown women in particular, that won't say anything until it happens to them with a white woman. Yeah. Then they're noticing. But it's like you have to notice it, you have to call it out at your level as well, because you're really instrumental. If you have that position of privilege, acknowledge your privilege and use it to help out. So for instance, for me as a black woman, now some people would say, black women, we're on the lowest of the pole, we have the least privileges, but I recognize that I have language privilege. I recognize that I'm an American citizen and I have that privilege, and I've used those privileges to help my sisters, my sisters that are immigrants, my sisters that can't speak the language. I can come in because I've had to deal in particular with the public school system and having to deal with white women and seeing how that plays out with my own children in the public school system. So seeing it on a whole nother level with, women who don't speak the language, Spanish-speaking women from Eritrea, from different parts of Africa. I mean, it was just a whole nother eye-opening thing to do. And because I've had to deal with those battles, but I have the language privilege, I was able to go in and be an advocate for those women. So just to give an example of how that's allyship and using your privilege.
Exactly. I mean, each of us have some type of privilege. And all of those privileges will manifest in different ways according to the situation. So global north privilege, right? The fact that we are in a global north country, when we have citizenship here, whether we speak the language, whether we've been to college, so there's class privilege, there's academic privilege, there's language privilege, there's global north privilege. I have caste privilege. Right, so it's like when I'm in India, that plays a much bigger role in terms of how I'm able to speak and who I speak to, and who's willing to listen to me and who's not willing to listen to me, etc. because of my caste privilege. But as someone who has those privileges, I have to acknowledge them and find a way to use them in a way that actually uplifts everyone's voices. Because if I'm not doing that, then I'm not really working for collective liberation. I'm only working for my own liberation, and that's not liberation. So it's not an easy journey. It's something that we all have to get to grips with, and we all have to acknowledge. But if I'm going to be saying to white people, you have to confront your fragility, you have to confront your privilege, I need to be looking at my own privilege and confronting all of those privileges. So if, it's like I can't say to a cis male, you need to be confronting your male privilege if I am also not confronting my cis privilege, my straight privilege, my caste privilege, my light skin privilege, etc., etc. And so that is something that it's not easy to deal with. And one of the things that I found in dealing with patriarchy and in mentoring men is that mentoring white men seems to be, in a certain twisted way, easier than mentoring males of color. And the reason why is because I feel, this is my own personal feel, is that with the white men, they've already been doing some of that stuff when it comes to race. So they've already been trying to confront some of their own privilege from that type of angle, whereas the men of color have been coming at it as we're the victims, and now for the first time in their life they are having to actually realize, wait a minute, we have massive amounts of privilege, and that is very difficult for them to actually consider, especially when they don't really care about the people who are being harmed.
Right.
If you don't care about women of color, why would you care about doing anything about it? And if you wait until you have a daughter to dismantle rape culture, you are too late.
Yes, exactly.
So that's something that I've noticed in terms of, acknowledging our own privilege and the different people and where they're at. It's something that is a continuous struggle. But we have to be doing this, and that's why we have to come together to do it, because it's very difficult to do it by yourself. So there needs to be a safe space for cis people to cry their cis tears. There needs to be a safe space for light-skinned people to cry their light-skinned tears, etc., so that the people with less privilege don't have to deal with that, don't have to listen to the whining and the complaining and the crying and all of that stuff, because let's face it, it's obnoxious as heck. And we need to deal with it in a way. And it's not that we don't still need to process, we do still need to process, but we need to do it in a way that is not harming people with less privilege.
So I know you talked about black and brown males, but does that also, how does that relate to white women?
Oh my God. So as I was saying earlier, this idea that, men of color put white women on a pedestal, right? Because of their internalized white supremacy. The thing about white women is, throughout history, what we have seen is they have always chosen their race over their gender. Always. At the Women's March, what did we see? We saw pink hats, symbolizing what? Pink pussies. Which frankly is offensive for multiple reasons. One reason, not all vaginas are pink. A second reason, not all women have vaginas. A third reason, your vagina is not the essence of your womanhood. It's objectifying. Again, it's coming from this patriarchal idea that you are your body. It's still putting people in the box that is their body, when what we understand as spiritual activists is that we are so much more than our bodies. And if you do not break free from that mentality, which is a white supremacist patriarchal mentality, white women with their white feminism are patriarchs. And that is why they have always chosen their race over their gender. That is why when it came to women fighting for the vote, the moment white women got the vote, they didn't care about the black and brown women not being able to vote. Forward to the 1950s, and you've got white women fighting for the right to work, while black and brown women have been working, raising their kids the whole time. Meanwhile, for pittance. And that still, to this day, is exactly what's happening when you see all these white women shopping every single weekend, buying umpteen pairs of clothes. But who made those clothes? Poor black and brown women in the global south for pittance, who can barely feed themselves, let alone their children, let alone their families, who do not have access to any of the same things that white women have. But the white women will talk about their pink pussy hats, and
hugging police officers.
Hugging police officers who are responsible for incarcerating women of color so that they can be used as modern day slaves in prisons for pittance, yet again, on slave wages, making garments, making Victoria's Secret bras, growing food, doing all of these jobs that the white women don't want and will never do.
Being subjects for medical experiments.
The fact that there was the pill that came out, and the fact that there were so many trials, and there were so many experiments done on women of color, so that white women could then control when or not they had abortions and when or not they were able to stop themselves from being pregnant. Meanwhile, women of color don't have access to those same things and are not able to actually control their own bodies. Meanwhile, that in and of itself is patriarchal, because why is it that women are the ones who have to put drugs into their body to prevent pregnancies when it should be men who are having to actually control their bodies? And so yet again, white feminism reinforcing white supremacist patriarchy. And when we look at the actual statistics, what we really see is who is most likely to rape white men? Who is most likely to be raped? Women of color. And of women of color, it is, in this country, it is indigenous women who are most likely to be raped. Why? Because the fossil fuel workers come onto their lands and rape them and harm them and abduct them and traffic them. And then after that, mixed women, black women, and then after that, white women.
And we could have a real good discussion about that. But black women are definitely on the highest of the
Oh
list
yeah,
as far as being killed, as far as being raped, as far as, you know. And I think that for me, you know, when we talk about black women's liberation, we talk about a whole system. We work from the bottom, which, you know, we've been placed and put, and we work our way on through. Black women have been systematically raped, systematically, you know, experimented on. The whole gynecological tool was done off the back of a black woman's slave. And so, you know, as you were speaking to before, so that's something that, you know, for me is really important to be like verbalized. And yes, our Native sisters are definitely suffering. They're definitely being, you know, murdered and tortured, and no laws are being, because they're on a reservation or what have you. They're not subject to the same kind of laws. And including on that is black women who have been definitely, you know, we're not allowed to be victims. We're not allowed to,
that's exactly
you know, they're not victims. They're oversexed. They're the judgments, the oversexed stereotypes that are in the media, what have you. There's an article, a really good article, Ain't I a Victim? You know, kind of posed after Ain't I a Woman, right? And it's just like talking about how black and brown women are definitely not allowed to be victim, not allowed to, you know, because their stereotypes are somehow they're less of a woman and feminine than these white women.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so one of the like what some people are talking about now in terms of the statistics is the fact that, you know, it is very possible that black women are not allowed to report things, right, because of who is raping them, right? If you're being raped by cops, if you're being raped in prisons, if you're being raped in these situations where, as you say, you're not allowed to be a victim, you know, that's not gonna show up in the stats. And so there are definite, you know, there are definite talks about, you know, what we see as gaps in the records. And of course, as we know, I mean, you know, in the statistics of rape culture, it's barely a fraction of what is actually the case.
Absolutely. And also too, I would like to add to that black women who are at a very high number of being raped by black men because of proximity, and also the guilt, the tribal guilt that has been heavily put upon them, like, oh, you don't want to tell my that man because he's a victim. But that is a huge number that we don't talk about. Our celebrities, R. Kelly and whatnot, you know, get away with victimizing. There's also one of the former one of the Black Panthers back, I can't think of the name, but you can definitely look this up, that wrote in his book, he wrote a book about how he would start by raping the young black women in the black communities to prepare for raping white women as revenge. But he knew that the black women were exposed, the young black girls were expendable, exposable. And many stories of that have come out. And so black men and brown men also rape. They've raped before. So that whole story and narrative of just white men raping is a falsehood. Yes, they do rape, but black and brown men also rape. Well, have been for centuries.
Yes. I mean, that is exactly like what we're seeing right now is like around the world. What we're seeing is rape being used as a weapon of war, right? Yeah. And what you see is that when you look at it, it's like all of the countries that were colonized by white men, right, by white supremacist patriarchy, where they introduced their white supremacist patriarchy, where they devalued black and brown womanhood, where they devalued black and brown malehood, and that being part of the trauma that is part of this process, where these people don't value themselves because they've been taught not to value themselves, therefore they treat each other in this way, and of course all of these divide and conquer tactics, right, because that's a colonizer's tactic, is get them to hate each other, get them to you know, commit these horrendous acts of violence upon each other. And it's a form of ethnic cleansing, right? Because if you've now raped all of the women in this community who are then forced to bear your children, and now their own bloodlines and their own community is now blurred. And so that's what we're seeing, you know, as a result of these continual cycles of historical trauma that is being inflicted. And it's not like there was not rape back in the day. It's not like our communities didn't have these situations. But now we have the added trauma, the added cycles of devaluing, of dehumanizing, of white supremacy that has been now inflicted upon them that's creating an even more violent, horrific situation for the black and brown women and queer and trans people who also get raped, but that is wiped away from the statistics.
And what I would also like to add is that it's not just black and brown women, but it's also black and brown children.
Yes.
That's hugely important. And we're not just talking about little girls, we're talking about little boys. I mean, so oftentimes those are the silent victims that get caught up in this, and of course to repeat the cycle. But what I'd like to do, let's bring us back, maybe this is going, bringing us full circle into what brought you to this work. Like, what was your own personal journey and story that got you really passionate about this work?
So I'm Indian and Hindu, and I was raised by very spiritual parents. They taught me a great deal about our own history, our own struggle against the British Empire, our own spirituality that celebrates and worships the divine feminine and the divine masculine, and the idea that is within all of us. And so that was my upbringing. That was where I was from, and I, in terms of my own spiritual teachers, of course your parents are always your first teachers, but I have spiritual teachers beyond that, and these were teachers that my parents brought me to, are and continue to be incredibly radical, and working for collective liberation, and so many of these messages I got from them. Many of these stories, from our own scriptures, from our own spirituality, from our own stories of the different forms of God, the different types of people in our histories who walked these spiritual journeys and what they were struggling against, and the women of color, the dark-skinned women who were fighting these same struggles against a patriarchal, dominant, colonizing empire, and you see the same pattern, because it's the same systems of oppression over and over again. And so I was taught that, and they were using different words, like the social justice community has its own particular lingo, and my teachers were using our words and our language, but as I have been an activist for the climate, for the environment, for economic rights, etc., I have noticed that what we're saying in social justice circles is exactly what my teachers taught me, and so and that has just solidified my own commitment to spiritual activism and my own commitment to collective liberation and the understanding that we are not our bodies. And if we see ourselves as just our bodies, we will continue to be locked in this cycle of imprisonment. Because when we're talking about the prison system and the industrial prison complex, what my teachers taught me was this material world is a prison, and we are all prisoners in it. And we are locked into this prison because our ego has convinced us that we are our bodies. And we have to break free from that understanding in order to see everyone and everything as a spiritual being. And when you see that, you're going to work for everyone's liberation, and and we can only be liberated with love. And that is what my teachers had taught me, using our words and our language. And in social justice, when I see that it's the same thing. It's just that people had not taken that logical step of talking about the spiritual aspect of it, because they were still stuck in this material sense of what is freedom and what is not. And so my work has been marrying the two things, has been to talk to people about what my teachers have taught me, and then putting that in the context of our social justice work so that they can see what the actual connections are to spiritual activism. Because any movements in the past that have been successful because they were spiritual movements. And they were successful because the people of those movements understood that they were not their bodies. And in spirituality, my gurus also taught me, you must be humble. You must know that you do not know. You must be willing to listen. You must be willing to open your heart and be compassionate to anyone so that they can tell you the truth. Because if you're not willing to listen to the truth, truth, you're not willing to be free. And so that's where I'm coming from, and that has what has led me down this path. And in terms of my commitment to the climate, it's coming from that spiritual perspective of, this isn't just the climate, this is Mother Earth. This is the divine feminine. This is the mother of God. I mean, the wife of God. The planet that God manifests in many, many different forms, in multiple different forms, in all of us. And so when I see it that way, and I've always seen it that way because that's how my parents taught me to see it, that's how my mother taught me to see it, it is a spiritual commitment to me. It's not just about, will we have a livable planet? It's about the fact that Mother Earth should be allowed to breathe. It's not even just us, it's her. That we are committing violence upon her. And that in and of itself is a crime. That must be stopped. How can we commit violence upon our own mother? How can we allow that? So I'm coming from that perspective of, if we all want to be free, Mother Earth needs to be free too.
So I'm gonna close this out. Are there any last minute pieces of information, or maybe you want some people to know what you got coming up next for yourself?
So Women of Color Speak Out, we're on Facebook. You can find us on Facebook. Look up WOC Speak Out on Facebook. Our website is wocspeakout.com. I also am a mentor for youth and youth of color, and there's one particular group called 0 Hour, and they recently did national and international action on July 21st, where they marched in DC and the Bay Area and LA and New York and Sao Paulo and London and Nuremberg and Butere, Kenya, and in all of these places. And their platform is a radical social justice, climate justice platform, integrating the science required for a livable planet and the methods necessary for justice and liberation for all. And I was part of that process with these youth. They're radical. Look them up. This is 0hour.org. Support their work. This is the work that needs to be done. And these are the people that we should be supporting. We should be supporting the people on the front lines of any movement, because they should be leading that movement, whether it's women of color, whether it's youth of color, because as you said, children are the ones who are suffering the most. And who are we doing this for if not them? So definitely look that up. This is 0hour.org, wocspeakout.com. We're on Facebook. They're on Twitter. They're on Facebook. They're on Instagram. Just go hashtag this is 0 Hour. Thank you so much.
So this has been Shauna Hawk with the Women of Color and Leadership Movement, and you're joining us for one of our first of many conversations on women of color and leadership and how they're doing their movements, and we hope to have many more. And you can find Women of Color and Leadership Movement on Facebook right now. We're working on our website and more things to come. So thank you so much, Zarna.
Thank you.
And we'll be back.